You can now listen to episodes of the Flying Monkey Podcast anywhere podcasts are available, like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, and more. You can also watch the video podcast on our YouTube and Rumble channels. Just search the Flying Monkey Podcast and make sure to subscribe and share. You're watching the Flying Monkey Podcast.
All right. Well, hello, folks. Welcome back to another episode of the Flying Monkey Podcast. Today we have a special guest with us. His name is Mike Bielas, and he's written a new book, and it's called Under Royal Protection. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, and a little bit about him and his background and things he's done. So welcome to the show. How you doing, Mike?
I'm doing really good, Tommy. How about yourself?
Doing pretty good. So looking at your background, maybe we should just start off with letting the viewers and listeners know a little bit about who you are and your background. So you're a retired United States Air Force, correct?
That is correct. Yeah, so kind of growing up, a lot of people look at it and like, oh, well, is this person privileged or not? I could definitely say not. I grew up in a dysfunctional family. So my mother was schizophrenic, heavily medicated, to control that. My dad was an alcoholic because he was a Marine sniper in the Korean War, had PTSD, untreated, of course, self-medicated. So over time, about between 0 and 9, the state of Massachusetts thought that I'd probably be best served not being there. My parents loved me. They did the best they could under circumstances, but obviously they had some issues that they were dealing with. So I ended up in the foster care system at 9. Thankfully, it was a one house setting versus 6 or 7, unfortunately, a lot of children go through. So I had more stability in my high school years there. So my family, biological as well as my foster family, I look at both of them as my family. So I was blessed with only having one foster family though, so that was great. So I ended up graduating from high school. Along the way, I found Jesus Christ as my Lord and personal Savior. Huge step forward. Helped me in a lot of different things, stabilizing my thought and my direction in life and where I was going to be going. Along the way, I met my wife, Leslie, awesome woman, also a woman of God, stuck with me through the hard and good times. Went through a 20-year career, like you mentioned, in the Air Force. Along the way, picked up 4 degrees, so worked pretty hard on education as well as adopting 2 foster children out of the Arizona system, and so I ended up starting a family there. Got out in 2012, went in 1991, got out in 2012, ended up as a enlisted as well as an officer, so I did both sides of the house as an aviation meteorologist there. Once I retired, was a chaplain for about 3 years, working with homeless folks, so I got to see that as well. Then took some other jobs along the way and ultimately started my business, Abundant Sources LLC. And from there, started doing things like teaching on an online platform, military aircraft, things of that nature, history, World War II. Then over time, started evolving and wanted to take on a project, is what we're talking about today, is writing a book and going forward with that. And again, that involved history as well, and in a unique situation evolved there where I was able to write the book.
That's great. Yeah. So again, the title of the book is Under Royal Protection. And for the readers, just to have a little bit of background, it's a historical with a little bit of fiction mixed in. It's a novel about the 12th century England during the reign of King Richard I, who is Richard the Lionheart. So it was also during the time of the Third Crusade and the Saladin time. So the book explores a lot of stuff. The story that spurred you, which we'll talk about in a second, to actually write the book. It talks about the things that relate to us today too, like economic hardships and the role of religious rhetoric in normalizing prejudice and the tension between law, morality, and religion and political power, and the collapse of the king's protection over the Jewish community. So, first, let's get to what inspired you to write Under Royal Protection, and what historical event or question made you feel like this story really needed to be told?
Awesome question there. Literally, I'm part of 23andMe. You get stuff through the email. Hey, you're related maybe to some dude, some famous dude 2,000 years ago. And that's typically what you get. Well, one day I got something a lot more specific. It was, are related to an Anasazi Jewish male who was thrown in a well on 6 February 1190 in Norwich, England. And I'm like, well, that's way more specific. So I'm not,
That's insane.
and so I was like, okay. So that got me thinking, I'm that analytical, scientific minded dude. And I just know 17 folks just don't end up in a well for no apparent reason. So I knew there had to be a story behind it. And so that's what got the wheels churning in my head. How could this happen? Why did this happen? Under what circumstances? So I had to come up with something a little more plausible, likelihood. And again, so as I started delving into the research and understanding the roles, the typical role, oftentimes, mayor, for at least some of the folks, was money lending. And then you had Jews, like you said, that were under the protection of the crown, but weren't necessarily part of society in the sense that they could not own land. They often were ostracized or thought as of outsiders because they were Jewish and not Christian. Um, and so there was a lot of different, as I was doing the research, I started unpacking more and more things, and I was able to create, like you said, the guardrails was that event. And that's a historical event, well documented on 6 February 1190. 17 Jewish folk ended up in a well head first, and they sealed it up. So that part, that's the guardrails of what I kind of was working on. But what I wanted to answer, the burning question for me was, how did that happen? What's the plausible, or what is a plausible explanation for that to actually take place and actually have happened in history? So that's what the whole book is basically trying to answer, that question in a plausible way. Well, how did this happen?
Yeah, yeah. Now, there's based on true historical events, and but then like when we were talking earlier, historical fiction. So it's kind of like based on a true story type thing. So how much is based on historical events versus the fictionalized characters that you wrote about?
So the event itself is 100% historically accurate and well documented. Now, I did do some additional research on what it was like in 1190 Norwich, England, or just England in general, medieval Europe. So I tried to be as accurate as possible with how the church was that during that time, how the crown reacted in the leadership, the monarchy acted during that time, historical events, like you said, the Third Crusade was going on, and Richard was also part of that. So all that's all factual as much as possible. So all that is factual historical documentation there. The part that's the pure fiction piece of it are all the individuals. So the main character, the Jewish moneylender, Edric, the knight, Sir Robert, Deborah, and other folks, Samuel, family members of Jacob, were all fictionalized. So none of those are historical people. So all the people that I wrote about in the book are all fictional people, plausible people, and within their historical context, but they were all fictionalized characters. So none of those are actual based. None of them were based on real live people. So all the personnel or the people within the book are fictionalized, and the events, of course, that they did in day-to-day life.
What did you find the most surprising thing that you discovered about the medieval times of reign?
So during that time, what I found was there was several different things basically kind of coming together at a nexus. And of course, being a meteorologist, I did a whole chapter, I believe it's third chapter, on the weather kind of throughout the year. The weather sucked that year. I mean, there was famine, there was people, their sheep were not having as much wool. Yeah, so there was that piece of it, which was kind of cool because that ties into my background. But it was also more than that. The other part of the nexus was, of course, there was a transition to Richard the First in that and taking over for his father. So there was some upheaval there. Of course, the Third Crusade was a big deal. The church, as well as the crown, were very vested in taking back Jerusalem. So that was a key tie-in. There was that Saladin tax that came in that were so on top of having bad weather, bad crops, bad sheep, or sheep shearing and not having wool and things like that, scarcity. There was also other. So now they're getting in an environment where they're being taxed by the church and the crown to pay for this crusade. So there's a lot of things that were coming in historically that kind of just came together just right to realize why the people were upset or were angry, particularly with Jacob the money lender, because it seemed to the folks in the city that they were always giving money to either the crown, the church, or taxes or something, but yet or paying rents and things like that. But it seemed like the money always flowed through Jacob, the money lender, and he never seemed to be at a loss for money. So with that, that's really kind of where that coming together in the story of why the people are upset. It wasn't just one thing. It was the weather, the history of, or just the crusade, the lack of crowns. So that's one thing, that the king, when he went off to the crusade, you had, underlings taking over and doing a lot of the stuff. And it may not have been necessarily in the best interest of the kingdom as a whole, but more self-preservation, especially during hard times, with bad weather and all that stuff coming together. So it was kind of that, again, that nexus of things just coming together. It wasn't a single event that caused the historical fact. It was actually a bunch of different things being all tied together.
One of the most, I guess, powerful or themes that stand out, was the persecution of a people that doesn't begin with violence. It begins with the change in the language and their attitudes and the social norms. And, so was that something that you consciously had noticed and wrote about, or did it just, due to the historical facts and what was going on, kind of just come out in the story?
Yeah, I was trying to, and again, this is a learning process for me being my first novel, trying to understand that because I tend, especially as a teacher, I want to kind of like instruct or narrate, and so I had to take a lot of that out, and I was advised to no, you're trying to tell the story not through narration, but through the story of the people, and so that was kind of a new thing for me to do. And so I had to incorporate all those things, the church setting. So, of course, in various chapters, I do have sermons that were done by Father Matthew. I had also the general public, the townsfolks in the pubs talking and what were they talking about. So I tried to instill what was happening from the common folk to the working class, like being the wool industry, the lumber industry, tanning, all the blacksmith, all those things in there, get different people's perspective and view throughout, all the way to lords as well as a knight in particular. So that was the other thing when I embedded the knight initially, because he borrowed money, he was the first one, that I put that in there. I realized that he could be a bigger character. So that changed for me on using him in particular. In one way, I was going to have him go off in a different direction, but ultimately I decided to make him do, or I guess protect or do the right thing morally versus what was expected of him from the townsfolk, or maybe even some like the sheriff or other folks in town. So yeah, so there was a lot of different things. It kind of evolved, and I tried to do it as a slow burn because obviously the cap point was the 17 Jews ended up in a well. The goal was through that 18 chapters was trying to answer that question without narrating it and explaining it or explaining the history, but showing the history through the eyes of those people who were living it.
Yeah, you did a great job of showing how ordinary people, all the different things, the conflicts that were going on, and how even just ordinary people were justifying the bad treatment of others, pretending to keep the peace. And we kind of see that in today, what's going on in the world today too. And it's just amazing. Like they say, history repeats itself. So it was quite interesting that when you read that, it's like, wow, like there's so much to relate to today. And this was what, 1,000 years ago or more.
Right.
So regarding like you had mentioned earlier, the character Jacob, um, he's just a man. He's trying to maintain the contracts and order and fairness, while all the society around him is changing. So how were you able to, or what, I don't know if it's something that drew you to his perspective, or how do you do that? Like when you get into a character's perspective, I mean, that's not an easy thing to do and write about, and you did it well.
So what I was trying to get with Jacob was kind of an even-minded, everyday, just a Jewish person feeling kind of like almost like a fish out of water in some ways because he's in a situation trying to make the best of it. Yes, uh, in theory, they had protection, royal protection, hence under royal protection, the title. But in all practicality, and it did start that way, where they did have protection, but they also didn't have certain things like rights to own property or be a lord or be part of it because they were separate. So it's kind of almost like a fish out of water, but they needed them for a very specific purpose. And they needed Jacob and his trade, if you will, because according to the church, the usury law was sin. You could not, it doesn't matter. Heck, they'd be rolling in their graves today when they see the 20, 30%, interest rates that they have now. But you look back then, even if a 2% interest rate was usury, and Christians could not do that to other Christians without it being a sin, right? So what better way of bringing an outsider in and having them do it because they're Jewish, not Christian, so they're not under those same rules, so they could do that. And I wanted to make Jacob an even-minded character, thoughtful, honest, um, good, good with the books, and just someone who fit that role as well as he did, and trying to be almost like that ballast, if you will, kind of that, because you get his with Samuel and Deborah, they tend to be more outspoken or more brash in their words, where he was more of that even keel thought process. There is what I was kind of going for, was that he was kind of like that rock, if you will, that stabilizing force within the book. Because think about it, he had a lot of money coming in and out of his business, and he had to be trustworthy, he had to be reliable, he had to be honest, he had to be good with keeping the books, he had to be good at all those things. And generally, you're not going to get somebody who's brash or outspoken or bucking the system as a good candidate for that role.
That's true. And then also reading, there's sermons in the book that they don't directly call for violence, yet they simply or clearly just change public opinion. So
Right.
why was it important to portray the influence, that indirectly?
Because do I think that at some point in time where it could have been more direct?
Yeah.
Yes. But being from the church, they're trying to have this, I don't want to say facade, and it depends, I guess, on that individual person. It may be a facade there, where they're looking at, well, the church is supposed to be about Jesus Christ, his love, his mercy, compassion, salvation through, and again, this being the Catholic Church at that time, and not the, because I've also, one of my degrees is master in seminary, and yes, I've had a very long class on church history, and that, unfortunately, between 900 and 1300 AD was not a great time for lack of corruption within the church itself, being the Catholic Church. So there was a lot at one point during that time frame. You literally had three different popes. So there was a lot of different things happening. So you had things that were historic, so it was a tough time for the church, and again, this is before Martin Luther came out, with the 95 Thesis tacking on the door. But there was a lot, it didn't just come to the 1500s where Martin Luther, there was a lot of things that transpired really between and during that 900. We had a children's crusade during that time, although that was not documented by the church, which is going to be a topic of my second book in part. But yeah, we had some crazy things happening in the Middle Ages involving the church, that necessarily wasn't the best for the people, really wasn't the best um, for the common person, and really, to be honest, wasn't necessarily how Christ would have looked at it if you're looking at it from a biblical standpoint, uh, uh, direction that the church should have gone. Do I believe that the church as a whole outright, hey, let's kill Jews, mistreat people, let's murder people? No, I don't believe that actually happened. So I try to portray that as honestly as possible without making it, without demonizing the church to a point. Yes, was there things wrong with the church back, during that time. Absolutely. Just like there is today, the church, modern church, there's issues with the modern church. But back then, there definitely was issues. But I don't think one of those issues was basically calling straight out murdering Jews, to be honest with you. Could that have happened? Sure. I do think that would have been, in my opinion, probably more of an outlier than a normal church practice.
Now, another character is Deborah. And,
Right.
so she witnesses the changes in the public attitudes before any others recognize them, and she's kind of seeing things like, wait a minute, something's going on. So what role does she play in the larger narrative in the story?
She was actually, I like considered the favorite cousin of Jacob, and so he often, and again, his tie, because again, remember he's tied to the castle inside grounds, typically talking more to lords, dukes, royalty, people of means, merchants, things like that. That was his tie into normalcy was going down to the marketplace where his cousin Deborah had a stall there, and she was a seller of wool, which obviously that weather pattern and everything that happened definitely impacted her negatively as well as everyone else. So that was her industry. So it was kind of like and she tended to be more spoke her mind. She was just as honest as Jacob was, but tended to speak her mind, give her insight a little more readily. Kind of wanted to show her as someone who kind of knew Jacob and kind of knew the ticking clock in his head and how things were working, and that kind of like as a confidant and a person to bounce off things, and for him to get marketplace and outside of the castle walls perspective, and that was kind of her role in that.
Now, the other character that was interesting was Samuel.
Right.
So his
Another
experiences, yeah, they're like they're subtle. It's not huge drama with him, but it's subtle. But like for example, he being denied credit, people crossing themselves, and then what I found or not hilarious, but just like, whoa, social distancing, all the communication exclusion without any violence. So why did you choose to show like the prejudice through small interactions with him instead of like major confrontations?
Again, kind of more on the advisement of trying to write a book through the narrative piece. Oftentimes, I guess new authors tend to, because the end point is ultimate violence, right? So I didn't, a lot of people try and jump to that ultimate violence like too quickly and truncate the story. And so I tried to do it in a way to show it systematically, not just in the castle walls, not just with the royalty, not just with the knights and the leadership and the reeves, but also all the way down to the people on the streets in the marketplace, the baker, the folks that are every day doing things. And Samuel was an example of that, where he didn't have a particular single trade. I kind of relate to him because, again, my business, Abundant Sources, is kind of like what he did. He knew how to transport from point A to point B, what roads were open, what roads were safe. He was good with transferring information and things like that. So he actually ended up talking to a bunch of different people throughout the book, from the tanner to folks that were on the road and other tradespeople, as well as farmers and different people. And so he was kind of that, where Deborah obviously was more concentrated with the people she met inside the marketplace and the market square. Jacob obviously more concentrated with those who are doing money lending and needing to borrow money or pay back that money. And then Samuel was more of like getting that further reach and talking to different tradespeople and just common folk out on the open road.
So when you're writing, it's a complicated thing to try to, you got the idea, you do the research, you get all this, and you got to place it, put it. Which chapter was the most emotionally difficult for you to write?
17. 100%. I had to like put it down for 17 because that was the event piece, So you're building and building for the 16 chapters up to that, and actually 2-3 months down the road, you're finally at chapter 17. I had to like pause, take a break for like a week or two, just because I didn't want to screw it up. You know what I mean? I want, now I'm finally at the point where you have the violent scene, where it goes kinetic at that point from not just a slow build and burn to full on violence. 16 had a little bit of that, but really 17 was the keystone chapter. I did not want to screw it up. That was probably the one that was the hardest to write because I wanted it after building up 16 chapters, you wanted that one chapter for that one event to be as, and I also didn't want it to be because there's a lot of books I read. I read, being, working with the military, a lot of special ops background, not a special operator myself, but working with operators, and reading a lot of those CIA type books. They tend to have violence throughout, right? And that seems to be, and actually pretty graphic violence, explaining how the person's getting shot and her head vaporized and things like that. I wanted to avoid that in this because I did not want to sensationalize or make the violence the main cornerstone of the book. What I wanted to do, I wanted it to be more subdued and more and let the silence settle for itself and let that land versus having this graphical violent incident. So I didn't want to screw it up. That's really the bottom line. So 17 absolutely was probably the hardest chapter to write because I wanted to capture the history behind it, the seriousness behind it, but not be over the top violent about it. So
Yeah.
that took me a couple of weeks to kind of settle in and focus before I wrote that chapter.
Yeah, so there's this. It's really cool the way you wrote it. There's this restraint where you're building it. All this tension's building, but it's like kind of quiet or silent in a way, I guess. And you just then it finally gets there, and it's like so. It's really well written. I love it. So to wrap up things here, for readers, if readers could walk away with one lesson from Under Royal Protection, what do you hope that lesson is?
Not to forget the nuances and what can happen in society. You can go one day being safe or protected to not, and it can turn on a dime like it did in under royal protection. Um, and just not to forget our history and forget horrible things like this happened, and they don't happen in a vacuum. There's a context to it, and so hopefully people understand that things generally don't change on a dime. They can when they actually do, but there's usually pretext to that and a build up to it before it does change on a dime.
Yeah, and to add to that question, just to expand on it, you spend so much time immersed in this period of history, right? So, what do you think modern society most misunderstands about the relationship between law and power and prejudice?
Again, a lot of the same things in the book. You have certain people who are favored, and other people who are not and have to pay. And so I do. That's probably the biggest parallel I see there, because there seems to be certain folks that end up going to jail or end up paying in today's society because they don't have the means, or they're the common person, they're not a billionaire or not part of a CEO, or have more pull. So obviously parallel there, the rich and those in power have the power, and they may or may not protect you, just like back then. So while a lot of things have changed, obviously we're not under a monarchy, we're under a constitutional republic. So obviously our government's different, but a lot of things still remain the same. Those in power, those with money, those they can tend to do more corruption and bigger things without the consequences that you or I would have in today. And that's really no different back in 1190 in Norwich. Um, and interesting enough, as we know, Edric was the one who pushed a lot of that as that young, and he thought he was the hero, and he ended up going to jail because he was not he was not the Lord that also helped instigate it. And so he saw how it runs down to the lowest common denominator who get the impacts of society versus those with more means.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
there's nothing really different today in the 21st century.
And
Still that parallel is still the same.
yeah, no, exactly. So now the most important question, final question: where can people get your book Under Royal
Oh,
Protection?
yeah. So I'm gonna kick it off on 15 June 2026 is the date, so not that far down the road, just over a week. I have it on Amazon. I do have a soft copy version of it for 11.99 that'll be for sale, as well as an ebook version for 2.99 there. If you do have Kindle Unlimited, you're able to pick that up for free, so beware of that as well. So right now, it's just going to be put out as a self-published author through Amazon Kindle project there. So that is where you can find it, and it'll be released on 15 June.
All right, awesome. All right, folks. So make sure you go to Amazon and in Kindle, and you get the new book, Under Royal Protection by Mike Bielas, and enjoy it. It's a great book. It's a great read, and I just want to say good job, Mike. I really enjoyed it, and I know all the readers are going to like it as well. So thanks for coming on today and sharing your story and your new book. And hopefully when you write the next one, we'll have you back.
Yeah. Thank you, Tom, for having me on, and hopefully people find it interesting and want to give it a read.
Definitely. Yeah, we'll see you next time on the Flying Monkey Podcast.
Thanks for watching the Flying Monkey Podcast. Like, follow, and subscribe to our social media sites on Facebook, X, YouTube, Rumble, TikTok, and Truth Social. You can also go straight to our webpage at www.flyingmonkeypodcast.com.